Hello everyone and welcome to Braden and Sane's review of every episode from The Fairly Odd Parents' first season. As a kid, this show used to be very significant to me, probably being one of my favorite shows. So, I decided to review every episode of the entire series, season by season, to get a better understanding of the newer episodes, which I have missed out on. That said, I haven't seen most of the later episodes, and I feel like to get context for them, I have to compare them to the earlier seasons, so reviewing it season by season just makes sense. So I will be reviewing them based on whether or not I find them to be a good, okay, or bad episode. So buckle in, as we're about to take a nostalgic journey through the first season of The Fairly Odd Parents. Episode 1A, The Big Problem. Timmy wishes he was older so he can stop being walked all over. So for a first episode of a TV series, this actually does quite a few things right. They introduced us to the main characters while still keeping them as the focus and introducing us to the side characters as well. This is Francis, Chester, and AJ's first appearance in the show, though Chester and AJ aren't actually called anything in this episode. Not only that, but Vicky gets her own side plot in this as well. The best way to describe this whole thing is quaint. There are a few jokes, but not too many, but at the same time, the ones they do tell are quite funny. At the same time, though, I do feel like the humor is this episode's biggest flaw, in that the jokes go by too fast. And what I mean by that is that the plot that is intermittent between these really fast jokes is quite heavy and long and drawn out. This episode tackles quite a tough subject for being the first one, and that is the harsh realities of adulthood. And overall, telling that message is actually done quite well, even if the ending was a little bit too long, meaning the rest of it is a bit cluttered. Which is a flaw, but I don't think it takes away too much. The things this episode does really well, it really excels at, and the things it does bad at are small bumps in the road of an otherwise good episode. The comedy's there, the plot's there, and while yes, there are a few problems, they didn't really hinder my enjoyment of the episode that much. For an episode titled The Big Problem, all the problems in it seem to be rather small. Episode 1B, Power Mad. Timmy wishes himself into a game he can't wish himself out of. This episode is truly a masterpiece, and the comedy plays a great part in that. Cosmo and Wanda trying to distract Vicky with their horrible renditions of TV shows, the running gags, of which there are a few, and Chester and AJ's dialogue make this episode fun enough to watch. But of course, this really creative premise, and quite an ambitious one for just the second episode, is really fun to watch. There are stakes higher than most episodes because if the conflict isn't resolved here, Timmy and his friends will die. And that's not me reading too deep into it, that's literally what will happen, and it's what's stated in the episode. As a kid, watching this episode, it was one of my favorites from the whole show, and I was worried that I would find it not as funny coming back to it. But it exceeded my expectations, and is actually better than I remember. But of course, there is one tiny problem. The plot is solved through a deus ex machina. Timmy makes a vague wish even by the show's admission, and his parents show up making the Vicky robot melt. Timmy, Chester, and AJ didn't have to do anything, and it kinda cheapens the good plot they had going. But it doesn't change my feelings that this is a good episode and one of the best of the series. Episode 2A, Spaced Out. Mark Chang thinks he's in love with Vicky. This episode starts off in a classic Fairly Odd Parents setting. It brings back a sense of childlike wonder and captures the sense of childhood really well. And I have to say that there's a certain charm to at least that part of the episode. Also, the visuals are really nice for the Crash Nebula characters. When the actual plot starts, though, I have to say that I found myself kind of bored. The comedic romance plotline isn't good enough, and part of the reason why I don't think it works is because the entire plot is basically a joke, and the entirety of the humor orbits around that joke. If you don't find that one joke to be funny, you'll be bored through most of this. The joke of Mark and Vicky's interactions being somewhat awkward in a mundane way wasn't really funny to me either. The only other major joke besides this was the joke of Yucatamians disliking things that most people tend to enjoy, such as chocolate. Because that joke is the driving force of the plot, not only can I not take it seriously, but it makes the plot have no weight to it whatsoever. What are the stakes? If Vicky finds out Mark is an actual alien, what really happens, and what really changes? And why am I supposed to care? These problems combined with the things that I enjoyed about the episode balances it to be an okay episode. And honestly, the problems weren't that bad. Timmy, the person who is off-screen solving the conflict, is almost given sort of a backseat role. Maybe make him and the action more major, and you might have had a decent episode. But for Mark Chang's first appearance, I have to say, this falls short of good. Also, one more thing I'd like to add about this episode is that they break the fourth wall in the third episode of your show. Even if this show is good, and even if this episode was one of the best of the series, that could come off as nothing but insulting to think that you've earned the right to break the fourth wall in only your third episode. Episode 2B, Transparents. Cosmo and Wanda try to act as Timmy's parents in front of Crocker. My favorite part of the episode was when Crocker set up a trap in a mystical creature's bathroom and Waxelplax accidentally gets caught in it before Cosmo and Wanda. That was a really funny joke, and it made me laugh the hardest of anything in the episode. As a whole, this episode has an interesting premise. Having Cosmo and Wanda try to act as Timmy's parents without getting caught is an idea that could have a lot of comedic potential. However, they only go for this premise halfway. Too much time is taken up by the joke of Cosmo and Wanda being confused by having to do human things like walking and opening. That entire part of the episode could have been cut out. It's funny at first, but it wears out its welcome quite quickly and lasts too long to justify, especially since it continues when they get to the school and meet Crocker. That part of the episode is extremely rushed, and it's supposed to be the meat of the episode. Sure, once it actually happens, the jokes that aren't about them trying to be humans are comedy gold and do line up with some of the classic jokes of the series. The problem is that when the best part of the episode and the bulk of the plot happens is in the last few minutes, it doesn't really feel like a story has happened. That makes this episode paced pretty poorly. I was debating what to rate this episode. Considering Crocker's portion of the episode and some of the fantastic humor, those could make for a good episode. However, the huge gaping hole in the middle of the story drops it down to an okay. Pacing problem is a big one, but it's not big enough that I think this is bad. It just feels like it wasted the potential of something that could be good. This episode, especially for the comedy, I can see how you'd like it. But I demand a bit more of a coherent story, so I can't say I enjoyed it for that reason. Episode 3A, A Wish Too Far. Timmy wishes he was popular so he can fit in with the cool crowd and win the heart of Trixie Tang. One fatal mistake this episode makes is conflating wealth and popularity. Sure, they do overlap sometimes, but this episode sees those two concepts as interchangeable. I do think that it hurts this episode because when you try to teach a moral like this episode does, you can't afford to do that. The lesson Timmy learns is that you should try to have friends that care about you for who you are and not the things you have. And that moral is taught pretty well, but when you stereotype the people who are supposed to be either the antagonist or at best morally gray, the entire moral can fall apart. There were a lot of times where they came close to making an unfortunate implication, but didn't. Timmy doesn't end up apologizing and confronting the popular kids because he wants Cosmo and Wanda back. He ends up doing so because he learned his lesson and felt bad about what he did, and it very easily could have ended up being portrayed the wrong way. One more line could have made this episode bad if that line had the implication that Timmy didn't genuinely feel like he could done something wrong. But the emotion of the story never goes in that direction, and it easily could have, which is a very positive thing. The only bad storytelling pitfall besides the conflation of rich and popular is Cosmo's transformation. In a vacuum, yes, they would be my favorite part of the episode, which is why they're the highlight. But in the context of a tonally serious and heart-wrenching scene, it just doesn't fit with the emotion of the episode, especially when Cosmo completely throws Timmy under the bus. There are a lot of things wrong with this episode, but there are things done really well here. This is a rare occurrence where we have an okay episode that I actually have strong feelings about. And honestly, I can see why people would like this episode and why they would dislike this episode because the pros and cons are so polarizing. If you're willing to overlook the cons of this, then you'll find it to be good. But if you're less forgiving of the flaws in an episode, I could easily see someone finding it bad. And personally, I'm in the middle of that spectrum. Episode 3B, Tiny Timmy. Timmy shrinks himself to microscopic size for a school project. My first note is that this is quite an educational episode. You get to learn about protozoa as well as human anatomy, sort of. They kind of hide the education into some types of visual humor, such as the voice box literally being a speaker box. My favorite part of the episode is Cheese Pants, because the jokes of Cosmo and Wanda eating the cheese pants as well as just the concept is quite amusing. This really is a fun episode. Seeing Timmy's adventure through microscopic organisms as well as Cosmo and Wanda's tour through Vicky's digestive tract is quite interesting, and the jokes in those parts of the episode are quite funny. Timmy going into Vicky's brain was interesting because we've seen concepts like that done on other shows, but it's interestingly similar to Inside Out despite coming out a decade and a half before it. I guess the most similar thing that had been done then was Herman's head. It's a good episode and really uses the classic Fairly OddParents style at its best. Although if I have one complaint, it's that Timmy still fails his science project at the end of the episode. The part with him presenting the project could have been cut out in all honesty. I guess you could justify it by saying that this universe's version of these microscopic organisms is so unbelievable because no one but Timmy actually has seen what he's seen, but it is kind of unnecessarily cruel. Episode 4A, Father Time. Timmy goes back in time to stop his father from winning a trophy he destroyed. The first thing I'm going to mention is that, yes, this is where the meme came from. It's not going to affect the rating because it doesn't have anything to do with the episode's quality. I just thought I'd point it out. This is another really fun episode. It's exciting to see Timmy on an adventure to restore the present to what it's supposed to be. 70s Cosmo and Wanda are hilarious here, and it really is heartwarming to see Timmy's ending scene with his father. Now that I think about it, the episode is quite the emotional roller coaster. It is as deep of a story as I want a comedically focused show to tell, but they really do balance comedy and story better than any episode so far. Timmy grows and develops as a character from wanting a quick and destructive solution to sympathizing with his father now that he was a part of the backstory that brought him his most prized possession. And there are emotional stakes for Timmy because his two best friends won't exist unless he restores the past to what it was. So, yeah, a decently funny episode with a well-written story and a heartwarming conclusion. What else could I call this episode but good? The only small issue I have is that Timmy, disguised as his own father, tries to court his mother in the past, which I think they could have avoided. There were definitely ways to write this story without including that. Episode 4B, Apartnership. Due to a misunderstanding on their 9,895th anniversary, Cosmo leaves Wanda. I haven't talked that much about cartoon episodes based on romance on this channel because they usually bore me. I usually don't have much interesting to say about them, but being forced to review one for this video puts me in an odd position. I don't have many gripes with this episode, but it failed to leave an impression on me. That's due in part to the fact that it's really hard to get me to care about a romance plot. I highly doubt that in the middle of the first season, Cosmo would just leave Wanda permanently. So that means there's no stakes, and I don't think I care about the romance enough to feel anything towards this. There were jokes I liked, such as Timmy's parents waiting for him to make their dinner, the cookies with Wanda's face on them, the styrofoam anniversary, etc. Those were all funny jokes. However, another weird part of the plot that actually did get me to feel something was Cupid. I was genuinely confused about why Mama Cosmo would bribe him with all this money. Can't fairies just poof things into existence at will? How is money valuable to fairies at all? Like, they would have been better off not explaining why Cupid rigged the dating game against Wanda than to have that weak explanation, because it really just seemed lazy. So by the fact that one tiny plot point is the only thing I even feel an emotion toward, you can probably guess that this is okay. By the episode's own admission, it means nothing. The last line in the episode from Cosmo is, "Today's our anniversary?" Which is so insulting. That line basically means that nothing was accomplished. And this is a nothing episode, because the whole plot centered around Cosmo thinking Wanda forgot their anniversary. What a meaningless episode. Episode 5A, Chin Up. This episode is certainly an interesting one. It starts at this convention when Timmy sees a fake version of the Crimson Chin and wants to see the real one. And I might add, Jay Leno does a great job voicing this character. And honestly, the setup to this episode is really important. Timmy sends the Crimson Chin into a state of depression because it's revealed to him that he isn't real. Especially in a universe where fairies exist, that has to bring down the self-confidence. The Crimson Chin's life is really meaningless because there are no stakes if someone dies in his universe. He feels that there's no reason to save people's lives if they don't exist. That's a heavy subject, but they managed to keep it lighthearted, and I have to say they did a good job. It isn't easy to keep your humor and have a serious story, but they managed to do it. I think it's done well here, because the Crimson Chin's depression isn't really depicted like the actual condition, and instead is depicted more as him being a crybaby. Timmy as Chin's sidekick was pretty funny, and seeing him go through panels of the comic book to try to right his wrong was really cool. It's a well-written story and uses the characters to their full potential. Also, I really like the designs of all the villains we see, specifically the bronze kneecap, as it does seem like they went with the theme of body parts for the heroes and villains a few times. The funniest joke here is in the beginning of the episode, when the Crimson Chin tries to kill people dressed up as villains. It's the classic person in a world different from their own humor. Aside from that, just the base idea of this hero being a wimp and a crybaby sets a humorous tone for the episode. This is a good episode, and it really uses its concept to the fullest. Having Timmy go into a comic book to save someone he cares about from losing all hope in himself is really nice, especially when you consider that in this episode, Timmy uses his wish to mostly help someone else. That's not something we see often, and it's nice to change things up from time to time. As formulaic as this show may seem, it doesn't really hinder this episode, or really any episode so far. And we must bring up the visuals. Crimson Chin's design is really cool, and sort of has that comic book muscle shading to it, and seeing the scenery in the comic book is also a nice backdrop to have this story happen on. They play a lot with the concept of Timmy being in a comic book, such as it being 10 a.m. in this panel, but not the one below it. Not only that, but superhero and comic book tropes are referenced a lot here. The style, plot, humor, and visuals make this a very memorable episode. Episode 5B, Dog Days Afternoon. Timmy wishes to swap places with a dog. I'm just gonna go ahead and say it, this is a bad episode. The fact that they would imply that Timmy is making this dog's life worse by wishing to switch back is really cruel. Timmy is knowingly doing this, and the episode is fine with it. Maybe if, from the beginning, they made this dog a jerk, which is what I think they were going for, then it would be fine. But they only shoehorn it in at the end so Timmy can somehow be justified in putting a muzzle on Doidle, and intentionally putting him in a cage that's too small. That's just above and beyond being unnecessarily cruel. Sure, they do make Doidle a jerk in the beginning by having him eat Timmy's dinner, but it isn't justified because Timmy in the end is the bigger jerk. Especially because he ends up winning in the end. And it's really stupid because the rest of the episode isn't brought up by humor. No, instead it's just boring. The whole rest of the episode is just Timmy trying to talk to Cosmo and Wanda and not being able to because he's a dog. Couldn't Cosmo and Wanda try to use magic to make it so they can understand dogs? Or better yet, why didn't either of them bring it up before they swapped brains? They never bring this up, and it's so frustrating because it's an obvious solution. So yeah, this episode really made me take off my nostalgia goggles for 11 minutes, because even in the earlier seasons, the show isn't perfect. Episode 6A, Dream Goat. Timmy gets treated like a hero due to a misunderstanding. So this is another episode involving Timmy, an animal, and a misunderstanding. But I do think this episode is better than the previous one. Timmy genuinely seems like he cares about Chompy's well-being, and in the end, Chompy delivers some well-deserved justice to Timmy. The jokes are quite funny, such as the one about the mayor being boring, and the one about everyone wearing underwear on their head because Timmy got caught after being given a wedgie. This episode is pretty funny, all things considered. It is quite clever on their part to have the episode hinge on a moral dilemma. Timmy wants to be treated like a hero, but he knows Vicky didn't actually take Chompy out of his pen. But at the same time, it is nice for him to see his abuser get some justice. And I'm really glad they did what they did here. It could have made Timmy look like the bad guy for wanting to see Vicky actually get punished for once. But thankfully, they didn't play up that side of the episode. And in the end, Vicky is still in prison. I also like this mayor character. He doesn't do much, but his mundane personality and the fact that people find him boring was kind of funny. I think this episode is good. Not too offensive, not unfunny, just a solid story. Episode 6B, The Same Game. Fun fact, Gilbert Gottfried stars in this episode as Dr. Bender and his son Wendell, who are essentially the same character, and they are definitely the catalyst for this entire plot. They won't give Timmy his ball back because his teeth don't look as good as theirs, and it makes sense that Timmy would impulsively wish for everyone to look the same because of that. But like the quote says, even with everyone looking the same, they still think they're better than everyone else, which is really a subtle way of foreshadowing how unfounded this idea is. Because at the end of the episode, they're shown to both have dentures, proving that their illusion of teeth looking better than everyone else is fake. And it also really drives home the lesson that Timmy learns in this. Their inside didn't change, only the outside. This is really clever because Timmy grows as a character even though he didn't do anything wrong, which is great. The jerk character doesn't always have to be the one that grows in the end. And yes, the Benders get punished, and the jokes that get them punished are pretty funny. Sure, if I have one gripe here, it's that the episode could be funnier, but the plot is enough to make it good. Episode 7, Christmas Every Day. First of all, I really do like the song in this episode. The lyrics are great and the voice actors, especially Tara Strong, do a good job of singing. The archetype of the Christmas special is one that is done on many cartoons, but I think this episode does really well at it. and does teach the lesson of things not being worth as much when they're more common. I also like the jokes here. Jokes like the running gag of Timmy's dad being overly protective of his eggnog and the personifications of every holiday. Speaking of which, I know it's not him, but all I can hear when I hear Robert Costanzo as the Easter Bunny is Charlie Clips. Is that just me? Anyway, the episode is good. It uses tropes of Christmas specials really well and even satirizes some, and it also manages to tell a more grand and epic story thanks to being twice the length of a regular episode. Despite being twice the length, you'd think I'd have more to say, but sometimes when an episode is this good, there isn't much more to be said than that. And that was every episode of the Fairly Odd Parents Season 1 reviewed. As you can see, there are 8 good episodes, 4 okay episodes, and 1 bad episode. And I think that's about right. This season isn't remembered as well as seasons 2 and 3, and honestly, people point to those as the best seasons of the series usually. So yeah, this season isn't perfect. And honestly, the good episodes aren't that good, and the bad episodes aren't that bad either. So to rate the season, I would probably consider it good, but lightly. This season had things I enjoyed, but there is still definitely room for improvement, and I am confident that the show will improve from here. So let's get to our top 3 episodes of the season. Number 3 is Chin Up. This episode was just funny from start to finish and really great stylistically. Number 2 is Christmas Every Day for being one of the best Christmas specials in a cartoon I've ever seen. And number 1 is Power Mad. This is the textbook definition on how you do a Fairly Odd Parents episode correctly. So yeah, that was Fairly Odd Parents Season 1. Special thanks to the Fairly Odd Parents wiki for giving me information for this video, and special thanks to Pieguyrulz for the inspiration to do this type of series with a different show. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next season.